February 3rd, 1945. Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. The mess hall doors groaned open and a line of German women prisoners shuffled forward, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Among them was Helga Schneider, a 26-year-old nurse from Munich who had once volunteered with the Wehrmacht's Women's Auxiliary Corps. She expected to find thin rations, harsh discipline and humiliation, the things she had been told awaited her in America. Instead, she froze at the entrance, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. The air carried a scent she had not experienced since before the war, butter sizzling on a hot griddle, the caramel sweetness of sugar, and the unmistakable aroma of pancakes. Real, thick, golden pancakes stacked high on trays, drizzled with maple syrup that glistened under the fluorescent lights. Her lips parted in disbelief. She whispered to her companion, Margaret Voss, "They serve this to prisoners?" Tears welled in her eyes. It was not fear that shook her. It was the collapse of certainty. To understand Helga's tears, you have to understand what she had been taught to believe. For years, Nazi propaganda hammered into every German ear a relentless narrative about the United States. Official newsreels portrayed America as a collapsing empire, racially divided, plagued by strikes, racked by poverty. Old Depression-era footage of breadlines was shown as if it were current. Newspapers described a mongrel nation incapable of discipline or sacrifice. Pamphlets circulated through auxiliary training schools claimed that the average American factory worker produced at 40% the efficiency of a German laborer. Helga remembered a particular lecture during her training in 1942. An instructor held up two photographs, one of a gaunt German housewife standing proudly with her ration book, and another of decadent Americans slumped in an unemployment line. The message was cléchant: Germany sacrificed nobly, America drowned in excess and weakness. Her manuals were explicit. American soldiers were supposedly ill-equipped, supplied with substandard food, lacking in training. She was told their boots fell apart in the rain, their rifles jammed, and their rations were little more than thin soup and spoiled bread. So when she crossed the Atlantic in early 1945, she braced herself for hardship. Torture, perhaps. Hunger, certainly. What she found instead was an abundance that mocked every lesson she had memorized. Helga's first real taste of contradiction came not in America, but aboard the USS West Point, a converted luxury liner used to transport prisoners. She and 64 other German women were confined to secured compartments, guarded day and night. They expected bare subsistence. Instead, breakfast trays appeared bearing eggs, real eggs, not the powdered substitutes that had long disappeared from German kitchens, served with white bread and pats of butter. The guards ate the same food. To Helga's horror, one American soldier left half his bread uneaten, shrugging as if it were nothing. For a woman who had watched neighbors boil potato peels for soup back in Munich, the sight was staggering. She scribbled in a letter later smuggled through censors. "This cannot be their normal life. Surely this is theatre staged to impress us." But the next day it was the same, and the next. The Atlantic crossing was only the beginning. Upon arrival at Camp Shanks in New York, Helga and her companions were processed. The guards who supervised intake wore uniforms of thick wool, well-tailored, and boots that gleamed. Their weapons were standardized, well-maintained, and clearly plentiful. The prisoners were served beef stew with vegetables, steaming bowls whose meat portions equaled what a German family might receive in a week. For dessert, there was fruit, luxury that Helga hadn't tasted since 1940. She clutched her bowl and glanced at the waste bin where another woman's unfinished portion had been scraped away without comment. She asked an American guard if food was rationed here. He looked confused. "Well, sure, some things. Sugar, butter sometimes, but not like you mean." Helga didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This casual attitude toward abundance was incomprehensible. But nothing prepared her for Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, and the moment that history would later remember as the pancake epiphany. On that February morning, the women lined up with metal trays. Helga inhaled the scent and nearly collapsed. Pancakes, soft, golden, drizzled with maple syrup, were being handed out to prisoners of war. She had grown up on pancakes before the war, when her mother would fry them on Sundays, dusted with sugar. By 1942, such luxuries had vanished. Butter was scarce. Maple syrup was a memory. Flour itself was rationed so tightly that many households survived on ersatz substitutes. Yet here, in captivity, the enemy offered her the taste of childhood. She whispered to Margaret Voss, "They serve this to us?" Margaret's face was pale, her eyes glassy. The Reich had promised them starvation in America. Instead, the first bite of pancake melted on her tongue, thick with butter and syrup. Helga's hands trembled. The tears that spilled down her cheeks were not only for hunger satisfied, they were for a world view cracking open. The shock of the pancake was only one piece of a larger puzzle. Every corner of Fort Oglethorpe revealed contradictions. The barracks were heated. Showers provided hot water and soap, both of which had become luxuries back home. Laundry was washed in giant electric machines that finished in half an hour, a process that still consumed hours in German hospitals. Replacement parts arrived almost immediately if something broke. For women who had lived through Gately air raids and collapsing infrastructure, the camp's routines seemed surreal. Lights stayed on, water flowed clear, the basic structures of life worked without interruption. And then there was food, always food. Breakfasts of eggs, bread, coffee with sugar and milk, sometimes fruit juice, lunches of meat, potatoes, vegetables, dinners that included desserts. On Sundays, portions doubled, and on holidays, the meals grew into feasts. At Thanksgiving, prisoners received turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and pie with cream. One woman, Hildegard Peters, stared at her plate until tears blurred her vision. An American guard asked if something was wrong. She could not explain that her tears were born of impossibility. The body itself became evidence that no propaganda could refute. Within months, the women began to gain weight. Cheeks filled out, hair grew thicker, skin cleared. German medical staff among the prisoners tracked the changes. By late 1945, most had gained at least 15 pounds. Chronic conditions linked to malnutrition, respiratory infections, skin disorders, even menstrual irregularities, faded. One prisoner, Johanna Metz, captured with tuberculosis, received treatment with streptomycin, an antibiotic so rare that it required special permission even in America. She was astonished. "They gave it to me, an enemy prisoner. When I asked why, the doctor simply said, 'Because you're sick and we can help.'" The irony was brutal. These women, who had once sworn loyalty to a Reich that glorified suffering, were now healthier as prisoners than they had been as free citizens. Word spread from nearby men's camps. German infantry sergeant Karl Brenner, 7 months into captivity, looked nothing like the skeletal POWs depicted in German propaganda. His face was full, his frame broader. He explained casually, they worked 8 hours a day, earned camp scrip, could buy cigarettes and beer, and ate the same rations as American soldiers. Helga listened in disbelief. No staged parades, no coerced confessions, just routine, work, pay, food, rest. It wasn't kindness as propaganda, it was simply policy. For some, denial clung stubbornly. Emma Fischer, a devoted Nazi and communications specialist, insisted the food and comfort were illusions, staged to break morale. "They are showing us a false prosperity," she hissed. But weeks passed. Meals stayed the same. Supplies kept arriving. Guards came and went, all living the same standard of comfort. Slowly, denial cracked. Some prisoners pivoted to new theories. America would collapse after the war, drowned by its own excess. But then came news of America's post-war boom. The hardest truth to accept was not that Germany had lost, but that everything they had been told about their enemy was false. One moment crystallized the revelation. Frieda Schultz, a former administrator, befriended Mary Jenkins, an American WAC supervising the camp library. Mary showed her photographs of her family home in Ohio, a modest 2-story house, a garden, a car in the driveway. Ordinary, Mary shrugged. To Frieda, it looked like wealth. In Germany, such a home would belong to professionals or minor nobility. Mary's father was a factory worker. Ordinary Americans lived lives better than German officers. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The war had not been lost because Germans were weak, but because America's systems, its factories, its farms, its logistics, were simply bigger, faster, and more consistent. By the end of 1945, Helga Schneider was no longer the woman who had whispered in awe at a tray of pancakes. She was heavier, healthier, and more conflicted than ever. Her diaries, like those of Margaret Voss and dozens of others, chart a journey from disbelief to reluctant acceptance. First, denial. This cannot be real. Then anger. We have been deceived. Then bargaining. Perhaps this is only theatre. Then depression. Our sacrifices may have been meaningless. Finally, a quiet, painful acceptance. This is their normal. This is reality. The pancakes were never just breakfast. They were evidence. Evidence that dissolved ideology more effectively than bombs. In Part 2, we will follow what happened next. How these women carried their revelations back to a shattered Germany. How their families reacted, and how their testimonies helped shape post-war reconstruction. By mid-1945, life inside Fort Oglethorpe and other American camps settled into rhythm. Prisoners woke to the sound of bugles or the clang of breakfast trays. They lined up for roll call, then split off to assignments, laundry, kitchens, clerical duties, or agricultural labor. The Geneva Convention allowed non-combat prisoners to work in non-military roles, and the Americans were pragmatic. Idle prisoners grew restless. Working prisoners kept occupied and productive. Helga found herself assigned to the camp laundry. At first, she expected drudgery. In Germany, laundry for hospitals or barracks was an endless, back-breaking task. Hours bent over steaming tubs, hands raw from soap shortages. At Fort Oglethorpe, she encountered machines larger than any she had imagined, electric-powered washers that could clean sheets for hundreds in under an hour. She wrote to her sister months later. "The water is hot, soap is plentiful. If a machine breaks, the part arrives the next day. I think of our hospitals where linens were scarce, where soap was replaced with harsh substitutes. Here they do this for prisoners." The realization was bitter. What had been considered precious in Munich was routine waste in Georgia. Other women were sent to kitchen duty, where revelations continued. Ingrid Schultz, once part of an anti-aircraft unit, remembered her shock at the daily deliveries. Trucks full of vegetables, meat, milk and eggs arriving without fail. One morning she saw a shipment of potatoes rejected for being slightly sprouted. To Germans who had fought over spoiled turnips, it was incomprehensible. Food that would feed a town for a week was discarded as substandard, she told fellow prisoners. Americans do not understand hunger. She later confessed the waste haunted her more than the meals themselves. Abundance could be tasted, but waste was a wound that never healed. If pancakes were the first revelation, holiday meals were the culmination. On Thanksgiving 1945, every prisoner at Fort Oglethorpe received a plate heavy with roast turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, 3 vegetables, and pumpkin pie topped with cream. Hildegard Peters, once a secretary for an artillery regiment, could not eat at first. She stared at the plate until tears spilled down her cheeks. An American guard, puzzled, asked if something was wrong. She shook her head, unable to explain that her tears were for the impossible. It was not merely that the food was rich. It was that such a feast could be extended to enemies in wartime. The sheer normality of plenty was more devastating than any deliberate propaganda. Daily abundance reshaped not just emotions, but bodies. Medical examinations revealed prisoners gaining weight steadily, 10, 15, even 20 pounds after months of captivity. Skin conditions linked to malnutrition cleared. Menstrual cycles returned for women who had gone years without. Respiratory infections eased. Johanna Metz, battling tuberculosis at capture, was treated with streptomycin, one of the rarest antibiotics of the time. She could hardly believe it. They used scarce medicine on me, an enemy prisoner. When I asked why, the doctor looked at me as if confused by the question. "Because you're sick and we can help," he said. For women raised on the belief that sacrifice equaled virtue, these experiences were a devastating counter-argument. Health, not hunger, produced clarity of mind. Comfort, not deprivation, built resilience. Their own bodies had become evidence against ideology. The most transformative revelations often came not from food or medicine, but from casual conversations with American guards and staff. At the camp library, Frida Schultz befriended Mary Jenkins, a Women's Army Corps sergeant from Ohio. Mary showed her photographs of her family home, a modest 2-story house, a garden, a car in the driveway. "Ordinary," Mary shrugged. To Frida, it looked like wealth. In Germany, such a home belonged to doctors or senior officials. For Mary, the daughter of a factory worker, it was unremarkable. Frida's worldview cracked further. The Reich had promised Germans a 1,000-year utopia, yet ordinary American workers already lived lives most Germans could only dream of. Elsewhere, guards spoke casually of college plans, of relatives owning refrigerators, washing machines, radios, even cars. Such appliances were rare luxuries in Germany, even for elites. For Americans, they were baseline expectations. The effect on the prisoners was uneven. Emma Fischer, a fanatical Nazi, initially insisted the abundance was a staged deception. She told her peers, "This cannot be how ordinary Americans live. They are showing us false prosperity to break our morale." Weeks became months. The meals stayed constant. The guards did not act like actors. Fischer clung to new theories. Perhaps America would collapse after the war from unsustainable waste. But when Germany surrendered and America surged into post-war boom, her denial grew brittle. Others broke sooner. Greta Hoffmann, a mathematics teacher turned logistics specialist, began calculating production figures using information from newspapers and guards. Her notes concluded, "A single American factory produces more canned rations in a day than my entire home district receives in a month." The propaganda of scarcity dissolved under arithmetic. By 1946, repatriation began. Thousands of women boarded ships back to a Germany in ruins. Cities lay flattened, infrastructure crippled, families surviving on meagre rations of bread and potatoes. For many returnees, the shock was reversed. They arrived healthier, fuller, even glowing compared to relatives who had endured the final years of war. Helga Schneider later recalled, "My mother did not recognize me. She expected a malnourished prisoner. Instead, she saw a daughter healthier than when she left." When Helga described pancakes, turkey, soap, and hot water, her mother dismissed it as exaggeration meant to soften her captivity. Only after other returnees shared similar testimonies did belief take root. The stories of abundance carried weight in shattered Germany. Diaries, letters, and whispered accounts spread through towns and villages. For people conditioned to view America as decadent or failing, the testimony of returning prisoners painted a different picture. America was not only powerful militarily, but materially, economically, and socially. This realization influenced the earliest stages of West Germany's reconstruction. Some former prisoners, like Margaret Voss, leveraged their observations into professional roles. With her background in communications, she joined the transportation ministry of the emerging Federal Republic. "What I saw," convinced me that Germany's future prosperity depended on adopting similar systems of production and distribution, she explained in a 1952 interview. Others drew personal lessons. Of the approximately 4,700 German women who spent time in US captivity, more than 600 later immigrated to America, often marrying soldiers they had met in camp. For them, the promise of ordinary abundance outweighed the pull of home. In later decades, many former prisoners published memoirs. Helga Schneider's 1963 account described her first pancake with raw honesty. "I cried not for hunger, but because the food was perfect and impossible. It was the moment I realized everything I had believed was dust." Margaret Voss compared the process to the stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Not acceptance of defeat, she clarified, but of reality itself, a reality more devastating than surrender. Through these writings, the women became inadvertent historians, chronicling not just events, but the collapse of ideology when confronted with lived experience. What makes their testimony so powerful is its ordinariness. They were not generals or diplomats. They were nurses, clerks, typists, administrators, women whose war service was auxiliary, but whose post-war memories carried profound weight. Their stories reveal that wars are not only won with tanks and planes, but with calories, clean water, and functioning infrastructure. A pancake could be more persuasive than a speech. A bar of soap could undo years of indoctrination. In the end, the legacy of the German women prisoners lies not just in their transformation, but in the ripple effect of their testimony. By bringing first-hand accounts of American abundance back to devastated Germany, they laid groundwork for a new understanding. As Helga wrote near the end of her life, "What defeated us was not only the bombs or the armies, it was the simple fact that they could serve pancakes with syrup to prisoners while our families starved. No argument can stand against such evidence." From disbelief to acceptance, from tears in a mess hall to careers in post-war reconstruction, these women carried with them the proof that ideology can crumble in the face of reality. Reality measured in hot water, full plates, and the smell of pancakes on a winter morning in 1945.